You're listening to episode 96 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Shala Nicely and John Hershfield join us to speak about how mindfulness can help those with obsessive-compulsive disorder. Have you ever noticed your mind spinning on a single track? Try as you might, the same thought repeats again and again. I certainly have, and mindfulness has really helped me to notice when that's happening, explore the thought, and shift appropriately. Now imagine having a compulsion driving behavior as you're spinning. As it turns out, mindfulness may also be helpful for that too. Shala Nicely is a cognitive behavioral therapist in Metro Atlanta, Georgia, specializing in the treatment of OCD and related disorders. She was a keynote speaker for the 2013 International OCD Foundation Conference, with the story of her triumph over OCD, Is Fred in the Refrigerator? Shala promotes the power of turning personal challenges into service to others as an advocate for the Adversity to Advocacy Alliance. She is co-founder with Jeff Bell of BeyondTheDoubt.com, an initiative dedicated to helping people learn to thrive through uncertainty and the fear and doubt it creates. Shala also blogs for Psychology Today, offering an inside perspective on life with OCD and the lessons of uncertainty. John Hershfield is director of the OCD and Anxiety Center of Greater Baltimore in Hunt Valley, Maryland. He specializes in the mindfulness-based and cognitive behavioral treatment of OCD and is licensed in the states of Maryland, Virginia, and California. John is co-author of the Mindfulness Workbook for OCD and author of When a Family Member Has OCD. He is a frequent presenter at the annual conferences of both the International OCD Foundation and the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, and a professional contributor to multiple OCD-related support groups and blogs. Our guests today are Shala Nicely. Shala, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
And John Hershfield. John, welcome to you as well.
Hi.
So great having you both here. This is one of my favorite experiences, is when we do an interview that's with more than one person. And so having you both as co-authors is a great treat for me. Thank you so much for spending this time in sharing your work with listeners. And I'd like to get us started by having you share a little bit about your background with OCD and with mindfulness. Shala, I'm wondering if we could start with you.
Sure. I've had OCD most of my life, probably since I was 5 or 6. And did not end up getting the appropriate treatment for OCD, exposure and response prevention therapy, until I was 39. So I had quite a journey with dealing with pretty severe untreated OCD while I was working in the corporate world. And my parents knew that I dealt with a lot of anxiety. In fact, they did not know I had OCD until I was probably in my mid-20s. But they knew I dealt with a lot of anxiety and issues with staying out of the future or the past. And my dad is a scientist, and so he would send me emails about research on meditation. And he started doing that probably when I was I'm guessing late 20s, early 30s. He was sort of drip on me. Shala, I really think that this would help you. Here's another article about how meditation is really scientifically valid. And I had pushed back against some of that because I thought it was sort of woo-woo, and didn't really know how this was sort of meshed with my life. But I decided to give it a try back about 15 years ago, and ended up with a little bit of an odd experience with mindfulness that turned me off of it for probably a good 5 or 10 years. It was just a group that I had gone to that they were, it was a mindfulness group, but they were also into some other things that I just wasn't into. So it just turned me off of it. And probably about, I would say, 5 or 6 years ago, when I started actually getting the appropriate treatment for OCD, which I guess was in 2010, I remember I was at the International OCD Foundation conference that year. That's actually how I found out about exposure and response prevention therapy. And I remember I was in a session about mindfulness, and they were talking about how it was really like training the brain, like training little puppies to, sit and be still, and it's hard, but you be gentle with them and all that. And I sat there thinking, I'm like, there's absolutely no way I can do this. Keep in mind that the puppies in my head are going to do anything but fly all over the place. So I sort of dismissed it again. And then maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I thought, well, actually, maybe I should give this a try again. Dad's continuing to drip on me this whole time with the articles. And so I started trying to get a practice together. And it was probably about 3 years ago that I finally was able to do it and started to make it a daily part of my life. And as I made it a daily part of my life, I started to see the benefits. And then it became even more important for me because it helps me distance myself from thoughts. Thoughts that are generated by OCD can be pretty overwhelming. And it helps you gain a lot of distance from those. And so I've found it very helpful. And, we'll talk more about how John and I got together, but John and I are each other's meditation partners, so to speak. And that helps a lot too. So it's a daily part of my life. I mean, I'll have lapses where I'm not doing it as much as I'd like, but it's really a daily part of my life.
Thank you so much for that. And I'm sure folks who are listening to this have the resonance or similar experiences with not quite finding the right place and the right group to practice with. That doesn't mean it's not out there, and one shouldn't keep trying. So I'm glad you did. And thanks to your dad for the encouragements and scientific validation. For those of us that it helps, just to know that that's also part of this. Thank you. John, how about you? What about your background with OCD and with mindfulness?
Well, I was just thinking, listening to Shala, how interesting it is that the people who seem to speak the most eloquently about mindfulness and are the most passionate about it tend to start as skeptics, and they tend to start as people who insist they see the data before they're willing to kind of leap in, which says something really interesting about mindfulness. That the people who are really the most taken by it are asked to adopt the fewest sort of goofy beliefs, because you can actually learn to understand it and understand it at a scientific or practical level. And it doesn't ask you to do anything else necessarily philosophically that you would sort of naturally be predisposed to avoiding.
Right.
You just have to get over that hurdle of really understanding what it is that you're doing. So in terms of my background, I actually remember, I don't think I've ever actually talked about this before in an interview. I remember I started out as an actor, and I remember in college, in my acting training, we would do these exercises before going on stage that were basically meditations. I thought they were pretty goofy, but I did notice that they worked in the sense that it was somewhat easier to be present in the moment. It was somewhat easier to do improv because you became sort of grounded exactly where you were, and you weren't really focused on thinking about what your next line was or something like that because your mind was more still. But still, the emphasis I had always assumed was on relaxation and staying calm. I didn't really understand what it had to do with attention until later. Then when I got into treatment for my own OCD issues, I started contributing to online support groups. And it was through that I decided to become a therapist, because I found that I was getting a lot out of communicating with other people with OCD. And as I was describing my process of going through cognitive behavioral therapy, people seemed to resonate with it, and that was helping me. And it eventually led to me going to graduate school and becoming a therapist. And I don't recall at any point in my treatment the word mindfulness even coming up. But what did come up a lot was this idea that what I was struggling with were thoughts, and that I was responding to these, thoughts in ways that were inconsistent with them basically being thoughts or being feelings or being physical sensations. I was responding to them as threats or as mandates or something like that. I had a sort of fused relationship to them. So even though I really don't think the word mindfulness came up in my initial treatment, it occurred to me after the fact that I was doing a lot of mindfulness. And this is without meditation. This is without practicing, the skill of developing mindfulness, but just understanding that you can be an observer of your thoughts and feelings and then make a choice regarding how you respond to them. This was like an amazing discovery for me. And when I then became a therapist, the first place I worked at was called the OCD Center of Los Angeles. And they used a lot of mindfulness materials there in their work. So I started reading a lot about mindfulness and meditation, and started clicking more. And I started writing about it. And it was through that the opportunity to work on the mindfulness workbook for OCD came up. And it was really after being a therapist, treating OCD and talking about mindfulness, that I decided to give meditation itself a second shot. And, I was trying out these different apps and telling my clients try out these different apps. And it was really just starting to make sense to me. And what was making the most sense to me and to my clients was this idea that, right now in this moment, you're mostly paying attention. And at some point, you're going to get distracted. But when are you going to notice that you're distracted, right? You can get to the bottom of a page of a book you're reading and think that you read it, but really you just looked at the words, and then you have no idea what you read. So at some point you notice you're distracted, and then you want to come back, but you can't. Something about the disorder says, no, you have to do something first, and then you can come back. You have to sort of judge and criticize and shut this thought down, and then you can return to what you're doing before you got distracted. And that right there is at the heart of the problem of OCD. So if you could develop the skill of noticing when you got distracted by your thoughts, and then observe those thoughts without judgment, and sort of return from them without precondition, or in OCD language, without compulsions, without rituals, then you've really sort of cracked the code on this thing. So developing the skill to do that more fluidly and more naturally, that's the trick. That's the practice. That's a lifetime commitment of, striving to be more mindful. So it was kind of an interesting journey that basically I had been engaging with mindfulness for a long time before it occurred to me that that's what mindfulness was. And before I started really taking it seriously and actually meditating myself.
You brought up some very interesting things, in particular with an acting background and doing exercises, which I remember with my own acting background, that we do things we're very along the lines of mindfulness. And you describe what is effectively an informal practice. You're doing mindfulness and not doing the specific kinds of workouts in the gym to build those mindfulness muscles. You're doing this in the real world, and eventually got to a point where, and there's that too, that aspect to it. So thank you both very much for that wonderful sharing. So I'm wondering how the two of you started your collaboration. John, if you want to continue and tell that story, and then Shala will give us another version.
So, the two worlds collided. I mean, it started with Shala and I becoming friends. We met each other at one of these fantastic international OCD Foundation conferences and hit it off. And, obviously being OCD therapists with OCD, there's a whole language we can speak that only a select few can speak. So it's kind of, it's a great way to make friends. New Harbinger, who's the publisher who put out the mindfulness workbook for OCD, and my other book, When a Family Member Has OCD, asked me if I had any ideas for writing a book about meditation. They have a series of books on meditating for, anxiety and meditating for this and that. And I really couldn't think of a way that would be effective for OCD to fill a whole book with just meditation exercises. But I knew that there was more to say about mindfulness and OCD. So Shala and I reached out to Shala to see if we could sort of collaborate on coming up with some sort of an idea where we could write a book about incorporating, like you were saying, both the formal practice of meditation, of mindfulness, and also the lifestyle that is living mindfully. If we could somehow incorporate that into OCD treatment. And then from that, pretty organically came this idea of, you're living with this chronic disorder and it's really hard and it's very easy to get discouraged because the work that you have to do to get better is also really hard and sometimes painful in some ways. If there was a way to pull it off that would allow you to also be happy, that would be great. So living joyfully with OCD became the sort of theme of the book, and ultimately everyday mindfulness for OCD was born. Does that sound about right, Shala?
I think that sounds about right. And I think that another point of collaboration that we had before we even did the book was we did a talk at the IOCDF conference with our friend Amy Jenks about self-compassion.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
It was called Don't Talk to Me Like That. And we talked about how OCD talks to you in this very mean, self-critical, demeaning voice, and that so many of us supposed to pick that voice up as our own and are really mean to ourselves, and how self-compassion is a really good antidote to that. And I remember when we gave the talk, it was standing room only. It was people were really interested in this topic. And so when John and I started thinking about the book, we thought about how can we pull self-compassion in here too? And because so much of self-compassion is mindfulness, it was
right.
a really good adjunct to that. And then also this part about living joyfully. It's hard to live joyfully if you're mean to yourself. So that was, part of the whole concept too.
It's interesting that you bring that up, the idea of self-compassion, which of course we have in programs like MBSR and MBCT, that there's an encouragement to work with that inner critic and perhaps give the ideas and thoughts themselves a little less solidity than we might otherwise give them, and have a little, see if we can practice some not being quite so judgmental about that. And compassion is very much a part of that. So thank you for bringing that up. So tell us about the book. What's the intent and who's the audience? Shala, if you want to start on this.
Sure. So I think piggybacking on what John said, the intent is really to help people with OCD live joyful lives. And the audience for the book is anybody who has OCD, really in any stage of the process, whether they're pre-treatment, in treatment, after treatment, in a relapse, in a lapse. I think people could benefit from the book. And again, getting back to what John said, OCD is a chronic condition. So there's no cure for OCD. And that's really because these thoughts that OCD picks up on and magnifies, and everybody has these weirdo thoughts now and then. Everybody does not have a little touch of OCD. I'll say that because I know that's common mistake that people make out there. Oh, I have a little OCD, and it's okay to feel a little OCD. That's not what we're saying. Is that there are lots of thoughts that we have, and OCD will pick up on particular ones and think that they're meaningful and we need to do something about them. We're working with the thoughts. That's right. So we have the thoughts. They're no different than anybody else's thoughts. They get magnified because of OCD. There's no cure for OCD because everybody has these thoughts. And it's really important to be able to step back from these thoughts and not let them take over. And people with OCD, we struggle because it's not that we're getting rid of these thoughts when you go through OCD therapy. You're just helping your mind understand that they're not as meaningful as your mind thought they were when you were in massive amounts of OCD. And so if you have these thoughts in the future, they can trigger OCD episodes, and being able to be really mindful and step back from them is part of being in a good recovery. And just mindfulness in itself, if we just look at the practice of mindfulness and, what we pull from Buddhism or Buddhist psychology, it's the thought is that happiness exists only in the present moment. And so if you can help people with OCD learn to live in the present moment versus living in the past or living in the future, that's where we think we can help people live with joy. So we wanted to bring all that together in this book to help people who are dealing with this chronic condition to manage it well and to be able to live joyfully as much as possible.
If I could just sort of jump in and add to that, this idea about happiness. I mean, like I said before, I'm a bit of a skeptic. I've never been much for positive thinking, but negative thinking, that's my strong suit. And when you think about, well, how are you supposed to be happy if you're thinking, negative thoughts? And, a lot of people will say, well, you just have to think more positive thoughts. And obviously it doesn't work that way. Like Shala was saying, happiness exists in the present moment. So what that means is if you're able to be in the presence of your negative thoughts, or what you're assessing as negative thoughts, and actually stay there and feel whatever it is that you feel when you're in their presence, then there you are, and there are the thoughts. Now, those thoughts are impermanent because all thoughts are impermanent because all things are impermanent, right? Including us, right? So at some point, you'll see the taillights on those thoughts if you just stay where you are and don't do anything to sort of keep them around. So when those thoughts leave, if you're already present, that means, positive thoughts, things you like to think about, as they're coming around, you're going to be there to receive them. The reason why people get so wrapped up in their negative thinking is that they're engaged in this project of getting the negative thoughts to go away. So they're turned to the side, looking at the negative thoughts and working on them. Meanwhile, positive thoughts are just swimming on by, like schools of fish, but you just don't know it because you're not there. And then when you come back from your little adventure trying to get rid of all your negative thoughts, you're just left with this sense of emptiness until another negative thought comes around. So I think, this idea of mindfulness and its relationship to happiness, it's not about having more of a certain kind of thought. It's actually about being open and available for all of the thoughts that come. And that way, no individual thought can really kind of take you away. And that's what people with OCD are really struggling with, are these sort of individual thoughts that just, they hook you. And you have a way of responding to them that if you didn't have OCD would perhaps cause you to have some discomfort or some irritation. But if you do have OCD, you get stuck in a loop. And the more you try to neutralize the thoughts, the more intrusive the thoughts become. The more you treat them like intruders, the more they intrude, and around you go. And treatment's largely about breaking open that cycle and learning to actually sit back and watch what's going on in your mind unfold.
Yeah, you both bring up so many wonderful points. The idea of how much time we spend rehearsing and rehashing. We're in the future, we're in the past, and not always so much in the present. And also this wonderful idea about how thoughts are not the enemy. We're not trying to stop them. And when I have a thought and it may have a little more weight, a little more pull to it, and just being with that allows that to perhaps more gracefully touch my awareness and move on. But Shala, I thought it was interesting the idea of distancing from thoughts, not being as a push them away, but in the distancing from the valence, the strength they have to catch us. The thoughts are still there, and being aware of them allows this opening to occur. So thank you both very much for so beautifully articulating that. I'm wondering what you've each found in working with people. How does mindfulness help with that? Maybe digging in a little bit more. You've already done some wonderful doing of that, but what else is coming to mind as how it helps, or some other ways in which it's helping people beyond the OCD condition? Are there other things that they're noticing in their lives? John, how about you?
I think the most obviously helpful thing is just understanding that there are three players involved here. There's your brain, there's your mind, and then there's you. And if you can sort of get behind that concept that you have this brain that's job is to just, crunch numbers and produce thoughts, and it presents it to this sort of screen, like a computer monitor, that's your mind. And then you're looking at that monitor. Well, how you look at that monitor is going to impact, what you're going to do with those thoughts and how seriously you take them. And of course, if you're too close to the monitor, if your face is like smushed up against the screen, then whatever it is that you're looking at is going to seem really severe and impossible to deal with. And you're not going to notice all the little details. You're going to miss out on a lot of beauty. If you can just back up a little bit and take in the big picture, you could see that there's all these little icons and all these little tabs, and you can sort of parse out how much attention you want to give to each of them, as opposed to any one being, so imposing or so threatening. And there's a lot of freedom in that. And the more mindful you are, of course, I think the more distance you get from that screen, so that it's just you become a better non-judgmental observer. And you also notice when you're starting to lean in and get closer and closer and closer to the screen and say, okay, wait a minute, I'm a little too close to the screen. I need to back. So I think just understanding that concept is really powerful for people with OCD, because one way of looking at it is that the people with OCD have this amazing attention to detail to a fault, right? They have a much wider satellite dish, picking up all kinds of channels that they would really rather not watch. And they end up investing in this sort of futile project of getting rid of some of these channels, which of course can't be done. So being able to recognize that, okay, yeah, so there's this horrible stuff that you pick up on that's really kind of brightly lit and obvious for you and it really worries you. But there's also a lot of amazing stuff happening in your mind that you're completely ignoring and not allowing yourself to pay attention to. You think you don't deserve it. People with OCD tend to be, very compassionate, very loving, very creative, quick-witted, again, because they're picking up on things that other people aren't picking up on quite as quickly. So if you can use mindfulness or become more mindful in such a capacity that you have more distance from what's being displayed on your screen, again, it puts you in the position of being able not being able to control your thoughts, but being able to guide your attention in directions that are helpful and valuable to you.
Shala, how about for you? What are some things that you're noticing in people that you work with, or if you have some, I don't know, maybe some success stories of how this is manifesting for people in their lives, maybe even your own?
I think one of the things that mindfulness does and that meditation helps with as the process of lifting weights so that you can be more mindful during the day is it gets back to the Viktor Frankl quote where he talks about there's a stimulus and a response, and the space between the two, therein lies our power and our freedom. And what I see with people who learn how to be more mindful is that they open up that space. When you have OCD, that space is incredibly small, if it's even there at all. We have an obsession, and the obsession demands a compulsion. That's the way OCD works. It's a very aggressive, loud disorder. It wants you to act immediately. And part of exposure therapy is helping people learn that when they have an obsession, they have a choice about how to interact with that thought and what they're going to physically do or mentally do with that thought. And so what I see people doing is as they learn mindfulness and expand that space, it clearly helps them with their OCD, because then they have space to be able to say, I've had this intrusive thought. What am I going to do with it? Am I going to do what the doubt bully wants me to do with it? Or am I going to do what's therapeutically appropriate? And I think as they see the power of that, they can start applying that throughout their lives, because it's no different than when a manager comes to you and says something and you want to have this immediate gut response, or you can stop and say, now, wait a minute, that's the stimulus. I have some space. I have some freedom to decide how I respond to that in a wiser way. And so I see people being able to take the lessons learned from mindfulness and exposure therapy and OCD and apply them more generally in life, giving themselves, like Viktor Frankl said, more freedom and more power.
It's interesting you bring up that quote. That's that's one of the ones I use every time I do a mindfulness program, even if it's just an hour-long introduction. I use that because of the succinctness, the elegance, the poetry, and the power of that line. So thank you for bringing that up. And Shala, I wonder if we might stick with you for a bit on another question I had. Is that one of the things that I make a point of saying when I am teaching, many other teachers do as well, is this reaffirmation that mindfulness isn't a cure-all. And there might be some cautionary thoughts to offer those who are considering mindfulness in a variety of contexts. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about things you might suggest to those who are considering mindfulness as part of their OCD treatment.
Yes, there's some thoughts on that. So what John and I think about that, and I'll of course let John elaborate too, is that we think that really mindfulness is exposure therapy and exposure therapy is mindfulness. mindfulness, because exposure therapy is about being with an intrusive thought and not pushing it away, not judging it as good or bad, being with it and not interacting with it in a particular way and letting it pass by. It is an intense process for somebody going through this, but it is the essence of mindfulness. I think when people for OCD are looking for treatment or wanting to incorporate mindfulness into their treatment, I think it's important to understand that mindfulness on its own without somebody who actually understands the process of exposure and response prevention is probably not going to be very helpful, because there's a particular process that we go through with exposure therapy where we're basically retraining the amygdala and what it thinks is threatening in the brain that needs some particular things to happen around, especially the response prevention. That if you're just doing mindfulness, wouldn't work. And for instance, I can give you an example. So you can have an intrusive thought and be mindful of that, and then have a bunch of mental compulsions after that and be mindful of that. And you just strengthened your OCD. Right. So that's not going to help. In fact, that'll probably make things worse. So I think if people are thinking about incorporating mindfulness into their treatment for OCD, they just want to make sure that they're working with somebody who understands both disciplines, both exposure and response prevention and mindfulness, and using them together.
Great. Thank you, Shala. John, how about you? What would you like to add to that?
Well, somebody told me just the other day that they were practicing meditation, and they were getting a little discouraged because last several times they meditated, they realized they spent the whole time just thinking, and they were really kind of down on themselves about it. And I said to them, okay, well, did you notice that you were thinking? They're like, yeah. Okay, well, good job. You did it. Because that's really all that I want them to learn is to be aware of what the mind is doing. And, then if you want to intervene, you can. But, the real problem is you get so carried away with the obsessing, you don't realize that you're even thinking. And so one of the ways in which sometimes the mindfulness concepts can when mindfulness attacks, it can be a problem, is when people are thinking of it as a way to stop thinking, or as a way to, primarily just to relax or to get away from the thoughts, or even, thinking of mindfulness as a tool as opposed to a way of being. Like, I'm going to use mindfulness and it's going to make this thing go away. I'm using mindfulness. No, I'm going to be mindful. I'm going to, challenge myself to sit with these uncomfortable feelings, to accept uncertainty, to be honest about the fact that these are the thoughts that are going through my head, and I'm aware that these are the thoughts that are going through my head, and not try to flee from them. That necessarily involves being uncomfortable for some period of time. It just so happens that, as you practice meditation, your mind may settle, your mind may sort of get used to resting in one place, and we'll pick up earlier on when it's become distracted, and we'll come back with more ease. And that can be a very relaxation-inducing process. But a lot of times I've noticed clients, and I've noticed myself do this as well, try to use mindfulness as a way to get relaxed, as a strategy, as opposed to developing an attentional skill.
Thank you. So, Shala, what else would you like to share with listeners? Maybe some other work that you're doing?
Sure. One of the other projects that I have is a organization called Beyond the Doubt. And I do this with my partner, Jeff Bell, who also has OCD. He's not an OCD therapist. He's actually a radio news anchor, but has done a lot of OCD advocacy work. And what we have done is created a daily motivational email program for people with OCD. It's called Keywords. And what we do each day is send out an inspirational quote. And then we send out with that, how do you apply that quote to your OCD recovery? And then we include an additional resource, which many times are about mindfulness, because both Jeff and I believe very strongly that mindfulness is an incredibly important part of OCD recovery. And so I just love to let people know about that because, again, it is a free program that we do Monday through Friday. And if they're interested, they can just go to beyondthedoubt.com/keywords and we'd love to have them join.
Great. Thank you, Shala. John, how about you? What other thoughts did you want to share with the listeners?
Well, just the first that our book comes out on October 1st, so that's coming up soon, and we're excited about that. And what else? My website is ocdbaltimore.com. I have a fair number of blog posts up on there, sort of my musings on different kinds of OCD and how to treat them. So listeners might be interested in that.
Great. Thank you. So folks who are listening, the sites that we mentioned will be linked on the episode page for this episode. So be sure to check those out. Our guest today, Shala Nicely. Shala, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having us.
And John Hershfield. John, thank you for joining us as well.
Been great. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.